How could an aircraft order from a small airline potentially change the shape of an entire industry? Well, this September, Avelo Air became the first airline in the United States to place an order for the Embraer E2 series, which is a big deal, especially for Embraer, but that's not what makes this story so important. No, instead, if Avelo is successful in what they are doing right now, it could completely change the face of America's low-cost carriers and actually maybe change what the term LCC really means. So let's start by looking at what actually happened here. On the 10th of September this year, Embraer and Avelo Air announced an order for Embraer E195 E2s, which included a firm order for 50 of these jets plus options for another 50. Now, there's quite a lot to unpack here, so let's take it step by step. Firstly, the time it will take to receive these jets is quite unusual. Today, if an airline orders new Airbus A320s or Boeing 737 MAXes, they won't be delivered until earliest around 2030 or so. But Embraer has considerably more spare production capacity than the bigger aircraft makers have, so Avelo's first E2s will start to arrive as early as in just a year and a half, in early 2027. The rest of Avelo's planes will then continue to be delivered until around 2032, depending on how many of those 50 extra options that the airline decides to pick up. But at this point, some of you might be asking, who even is Avelo and why should we care about anything that they do? Well, this is quite a new airline. Technically, they have some lineage going back to the late 1980s and an airline called Casino Express, who was called that way because they actually flew people to a casino in Elko, Nevada. That airline then broadened their scope and renamed themselves Extra Airways. But they still remained relatively small, operating as a charter with only a tiny jet fleet. That was until around 2018 when they effectively stopped operating altogether. But they still kept one aircraft, just so that they wouldn't lose their air operator certificate with the FAA. Then, in their now current form, Avelo opened for business in April of 2021, just as the world was slowly beginning to think about flying again after the worst of the pandemic. Avelo's first operational base was Burbank in California, and the aircraft that they began operating with were second-hand Boeing 737-800s. They then tried to avoid direct competition with existing airlines, which is a smart idea, by scheduling services from Burbank to destinations not previously served directly from there, which is a strategy worth remembering here. Eventually, they also launched more bases, like New Haven in Connecticut, and they also added the smaller 737-700 to their fleet. And as we record this, they are operating 22 aircraft, 14 737-800s and 8 737-700s, all of whom have been previously used by other airlines. Now, to understand the logic behind using such a fleet and the airline's choice of network, we have to talk a little bit more about how low-cost carriers, or LCCs, actually work. And yes, I know that I have explained some of this in previous videos already, so I'm going to give you just a broad description now. It is also worth noting that in the US there is a distinction between low-cost carriers and ultra-low-cost carriers, or ULCCs. But I'm mostly going to use the term LCC for all of them in this video, and you'll soon see why. The side of low-cost carriers that passengers are most familiar with is the fact that they generally strip their fares down so that the base fare only includes a passenger seat, and you can then pay extra for things like luggage, special seats and other options. Now, this strategy used to differentiate LCCs from most other airlines, but by now some of those other airlines are also offering bare fares, which is partly why the LCC picture is getting a bit blurred. But from the airline's point of view, the way that most LCCs actually make their money has more to do with the way that they utilize their fleets than how they charge their customers. You see, very broadly speaking, LCCs operate in two different ways. Most of them, especially the larger ones, aim to get the maximum possible utilization of their aircraft, basically following the notion that aircraft only makes money when they fly. So these airlines want to keep them in the air as much as possible. That means, among other things, making very quick turnarounds to squeeze as many flights per day out of each aircraft as possible. That means that if the airline is paying a leasing company to use the plane, or they have financed their fleet through maybe expensive loans from a bank, well, then they get as much revenue as possible out of them. But that's obviously only effective if they can keep those planes full for all of those extra flights and throughout the year, which is actually a quite big if. Most low-cost carriers operate this way, like Southwest, Spirit and Frontier in the US, or Ryanair, Wizz Air and EasyJet in Europe. Again, some of these airlines call themselves LCCs, others ULCCs, but the fundamental strategy is the same. Now, because these type of airlines needs to keep their jets as full as possible, meaning what we call keeping a high load factor, they also need to design their networks very carefully to make sure that they always can achieve that. And obviously, that very high utilization also means that they want these jets to be very new and efficient to save as much as possible on fuel and maintenance. But what if you could have a fleet of jets that didn't include high leasing costs or expensive financing? Well, that brings me to the second kind of LCC operation, the one that keeps its jets on the ground unless almost all of its plane's seats are full. For most airlines, that's only possible if they buy old, used jets, or if they can lease their aircraft under very favorable terms. And as you have probably guessed by now, that's exactly the kind of operation that Avelo first started with. Remember, they got started back in 2021, and one of the effects of the pandemic was that there was very little demand for used single-aisle jets, like Boeing 737-800 and 700. So Avelo therefore got some really good deals there, and could subsequently afford to keep those jets parked when they didn't have enough passengers, even cancelling flights sometimes if needed. Now, of course, they were not the first airline to do this, far from it. Allegiant Air is another one, which is also active in the United States, and many other airlines who today fly newer jets also started out in a similar way. In fact, this strategy of using old jets infrequently is often seen as simply a stepping stone for all LCCs until they can scale up their operations enough to transition onto a new fleet. But not everybody takes that step. Allegiant also operated like this for 2 or 3 decades with a relatively small fleet, although they are now expanding and introducing brand new 737 MAX 8s, which means that they're finally making that jump up to high utilization, newer aircraft, low-cost carrier style. By the way, Avelo's founder and CEO is Andrew Levy, who was previously the chief financial officer at United Airlines, but before that he actually was the president of Allegiant Air, so he has done this before. But the question here, and what makes this so exciting, is will Avelo do the same thing? Swap their second or third hand 737s for newer planes? And if so, what makes their strategy any different? Well, what makes them very unusual is their choice of aircraft. More specifically, their choice of aircraft size and how it fits with the American market. But before we get to that, when was the last time that you were sent an invite to a Google Meet regarding your recent successful crypto transaction, or received a robocall or a phishing attempt? I'm gonna guess quite recently, and there is a reason for that. Your personal information has probably been scooped up legally by several companies known as data brokers, who are now packaging it up and selling it to the highest bidders. And this will expose you to serious risks of identity theft, scams, harassment and even doxing. And the risk is just increasing every single day. That's why I am so happy to introduce today's sponsor, Delete Me. They are a hands-free service that will help remove your personal data from all of the hundreds of data brokers that are now selling it, without you having to move a single finger. Let me show you how it works. You start by inputting the information you want removed into Delete Me, like your email address for example, and Delete Me will then start scanning for it. When they find a page that's selling it, they will submit an immediate removal request and then keep following that up whilst also updating you on the progress every single week. When I started, I found out that more than 150 different brokers were selling my data, and Delete Me is now handling all of them in a legally correct way, which is why they are trusted by professionals like judges, medical providers and journalists. Now, if you want to join, scan this QR code to give you a 20% discount off the normal price. So basically use that one or go over to joindeleteme.com/mentor now and use the code MENTORNOW to claim your discount. Thank you, Delete Me. Now let's get back to the story. So one question that I didn't really explain before is why American low-cost carriers are different from those in, for example, Europe. Again, this is a complicated topic, but the simplified answer is that the United States has a very different kind of route network. Distances are one factor, but more importantly, the US has an extensive network of regional and smaller airports spread out over the whole country. And connecting all of those typically means flying through bigger airport hubs, forcing your passengers to take multi-leg flights, since it would be impossible to connect the small airports directly with each other. Or would it? Well, the problem is that many of these airports serve smaller towns and communities, so passenger demand between these smaller airports will always be quite limited. So even if it would be possible to fill up a 737 or an Airbus A320 with people for some part of the year on those routes, it might not work all year around. And that's why American low-cost airlines can't easily mimic the operations of European LCCs who are using direct connections all the time, even though passengers generally do prefer those type of direct flights. But what if an American LCC deliberately chose to fly smaller jets? That wouldn't just make it possible to connect small airports directly with each other, it would also allow that airline to avoid the direct competition with other airlines. And that would also mean that even if they would price their tickets the same as a mainline carrier who was doing multi-leg flights, people would likely prefer not having to go through a hub. At least I know I wouldn't. And that brings us to Avelo's choice of new aircraft, the fantastic Embraer E195 E2. Now, it's not really surprising that a lot of people in the United States think of Embraer as a manufacturer of regional jets, because with a very few exceptions, the only Embraers in commercial service in the US are E175s, in the hands of wholly owned subsidiaries of the big three, American, Delta Airlines, United and some people might also remember the older ERJ 135s and 145s who were also regional jets. But in fact, the E175 is only the smaller member of the Embraer E-jet family, which also includes the E190 and the E195. And outside of the United States, these bigger jets have outsold the E175 many times over. Now, the reason that we haven't seen more bigger Embraers in the United States has to do with deals that the US airlines have made with their pilot unions, which I won't go into here. But the point is that even though there are around 1,000 Embraer E175s in service in the US, the Brazilian manufacturer hasn't scored any sales of its latest, most efficient versions of its bigger E-jets, the E190 E2 and the E195 E2 there. And that is a fact that, of course, have now just changed thanks to Avelo. So let's see how they are planning to use these jets and where. Now, here I'm going to rely heavily on the analysis by John Ostrower in the Air Current as well as Chris Sloan in Leham News, and those are both amazing resources for aviation news, which I hope that you have already checked out, and if you haven't, you really should. Like I already said, it's the size of these Embraer E2s that makes them key to Avelo, and that's for two main reasons. Firstly, it's because of their passenger capacity. Today, Avelo's smallest available jet, the 737-700, is configured with 149 seats and the 737-800 with 189. Now, some markets actually have high demand for most of the year, making the bigger 737-800 work well, so Avelo plans to keep those around for a bit longer. But the 737-700s simply aren't small enough for those direct small-to-small airport routes that Avelo is now going to focus on. So this is where they will now fit in their new E195 E2s with about 140 seats. That's 9 seats less than the 737-700, and 9 less might not sound a lot, but it is, trust me. It will actually make a huge difference. You see, the other factor where size really matters is when it comes to the type of runways that these jets will operate from. I've already mentioned New Haven in Connecticut. This airport has one runway that's just 5,600 feet, or about 1,700 meters long. It is now being extended to 6,635 feet, or 2,020 meters, but that's still a tight squeeze for a fully loaded 737-800, or even a 700 depending on how far it has to fly. But Avelo wants to fly from even smaller airports than that. In November this year, they're starting a service to Key West International Airport in Florida, whose one runway is just 5,076 feet, or 1,547 meters long. Now, the 737 is quite a capable flying machine. I really love it myself, but it's far from ideal for runways like that. Operators like American, Delta and United do go to Key West by using either E175s or sometimes Airbus A319s or even the occasional A320, but that's rare. Now, not only is the Embraer E2 capable of operating from smaller runways than the 737 is, just due to its size, but it also has a new ace up its sleeve. You see, Embraer is introducing a new system to its E2 called the Embraer Enhanced Takeoff System, or E2TS. This is an automated takeoff system where the aircraft's autopilot handles the rotation instead of the flight crew. And that allows the aircraft to rotate at slightly lower speeds or at higher weights with the same speed, since the margins can be slightly smaller using automation. Now, operating with a higher weight whilst using the same short runway allows that flight to carry some extra fuel for a longer range or to carry more passengers, or a combination. And Embraer claims that when taking off from Key West, an E195 E2 can carry fuel for an additional 400 nautical miles of range thanks to this system. So all of this explains why Avelo is going for the new Embraer instead of buying 737 MAX 7s. Other than the fact that the MAX 7 isn't even in service yet, it's actually slightly bigger than the 737-700 that Avelo is currently using. And that means that it just has too many seats. And the Embraer is also still better when operating from smaller runways. But I think crucially here, the Embraer E195 E2 is also more efficient than the MAX 7. Much more efficient. You would think that since the MAX 7 isn't even certified yet, that when it is certified, it should be the most efficient jet in service. But according to Liham News, the E195 E2 actually has a per seat efficiency advantage over the MAX 7 of around 10%. Now that is incredible, especially when you factor in that both of these jets have the latest generation of engines under their wings. The reason for this massive difference has to do with the fact that the 737 MAX 7 is basically a shrunk down 737 MAX 8, which means that Boeing optimized the MAX's weight around the MAX 8, making the smaller MAX 7 heavier than it needs to be. That is in contrast to the previous 737 family, the NG, where the 737-700 was the base model. The 737-800 ended up being much more popular, but it was stretched and slightly compromised in performance compared to the 700. On the other hand, Embraer designed the E2 family with different wings and other key components for each variant, which is highly unusual and more expensive during development, but it also optimizes each variant very well, creating more efficient aircraft. Now, I know that some of you have been waiting for me to mention Breeze Airways here, because Breeze have actually done the same thing that Avelo is now doing, operating smaller jets, initially Embraer E190s and E195s, to fly directly between smaller or less popular destinations. In fact, it was Breeze's CEO, David Neeleman, who pointed out that a big reason why Spirit and Southwest have been struggling lately is because their planes are just too big for their market. Southwest have been forced to use 737 MAX 8s on routes where they previously operated smaller 737-700s, and Spirit ordered more Airbus A321neos than Airbus A320neos, unlike their previous mix of more legacy A320s than the A321s. But Breeze then didn't order E190 E2s or E195 E2s to replace its older E-jets, which would have made sense since the E2s and their previous E-jets have a common type rating and would share a lot operationally. Now instead, Breeze introduced a completely separate type, the Airbus A220. So why? Well, the answer is because the Airbus A220 has more range than the Embraer E2 does. That was very important for Breeze because they wanted to also offer transcontinental flights and even called Airbus to add extra fuel tanks to the Airbus A220-300 to make flights to Europe possible. But for someone who doesn't need all of that range, the Embraer E2 actually has an advantage over the Airbus A220 because it is lighter. Avelo's average flight leg today is about 2.5 hours, or around 810 miles. And the E195-E2 can fly 3,000 nautical miles with a full load of passengers, or 2,600 nautical miles after taking off from a 5,000-foot runway like the one in Key West, at least according to Leham News. And Avelo's longest current flight is between Hartford in Connecticut and Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic, which is a flight of around 1,428 nautical miles. So the E2 has more than enough range to cover all of Avelo's current needs. The E2's lighter weight also brings another big bonus here. You see, the Airbus A220 and the E2 both use Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan engines. Different versions, but with the same fan size. And that matters because the Embraer's PW1900G engine is pushed less hard than the PW1500G of the Airbus A220 thanks to that lower weight, which is likely why the Embraer E2s haven't had as much problems with their engines as the Airbus A220 has. So that's really important. Anyway, Avelo, like Breeze, are now reshaping the LCC market by avoiding competition with mainlines and regionals thanks to their right-sized aircraft. Avelo aren't changing their strategy, they're simply changing their fleet to one that matches their strategy better than before, and they're doing this at a time when more traditional LCCs like Spirit, Frontier and Southwest are adding premium seating and other options for passengers, confusing the meaning of LCC or ULCC even further. So if this all goes well, we might be seeing the dawn of a successful US LCC model that looks more like the European one, point-to-point directly, but in smaller jets. So how are Avelo's finances looking then? Well, here it is worth mentioning that they have faced some up and downs lately. Their first quarter in 2025 was the worst since 2023 because their load factor dropped down to 71.7%, which is horrible. But they then thankfully did much better in the months that follow, and having had access to that smaller jet that they have on order would probably have helped there. But the fact is that while this airline still relies on 737, 700s and 800s, they can't really choose good markets to differentiate themselves because anyone else who has 737s can also fly on those same routes. Ironically perhaps, Avelo are currently competing with the very airline that they followed into this new model, Breeze Airways. They both already fly to popular destinations from the same airports like New Haven and Hartford in Connecticut, and for now at least, Breeze has the better fleet. But it will be super interesting to see what happens when Avelo's E2 jets start to arrive. Now, I personally love that this deal came through because I like what Embraer is doing, and I have long been really annoyed about the fact that the E2 family haven't been used so much in North America so far. So this should shake things up a little bit, which I think is great. But what do you think? Have you flown with Avelo or Breeze yet? And do you agree that these airlines are changing the LCC market in the States? Or do you think that we're missing something? Let me know in the comments below. I love hearing from you, and please leave a like and subscribe to the channel when you're down there. Also, I hope that you like these nerdy deep dives into the aviation industry and other fascinating technologies that make these changes possible. And if you do, you should definitely check out Ben's and my podcast over on the Captain Speaking channel, where we talk from the heart, unscripted, about everything aviation and everything in between, so I think that you would really love it. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Now. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.